So this is our second snippet for this week. We're going to be looking at the Roosevelt presidency, 1901 to 1909. I like this photograph because Roosevelt, as president, wants to project U.S. influence onto the international scene, and I think he's, in terms of our course, he's a really significant president in kind of emerging the United States into a more active player internationally for good or ill. It is worth remembering with Roosevelt. He's a good example also of the importance of contingency in history. That things are very rarely inevitable in history. Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigns his position. He creates his own kind of military unit that fights in the Spanish-American War. Becomes very popular. Is elected governor of New York on the basis of that popularity. There are sort of party interests in the Republican Party who thinks that he's rising too far or too fast. They want to kind of sidetrack him. McKinley has a vacancy as vice president because his first vice president had passed away. McKinley offers the position to Roosevelt, and the assumption is that this is a dead-end position. It's a way to sort of stall Roosevelt's political career because, vice president, what does a vice president do? And then McKinley is assassinated. So, Roosevelt is not supposed to be president. If the way this had worked out the way the party leaders wanted it to work out, Roosevelt never would have been heard from again. Instead, he's president during this period, and he largely makes foreign policy outside of congressional pressure. So it's an early pattern of this idea of presidential foreign policy. And Roosevelt's core argument is that the world is changing in disruptive ways, and the United States needs to, sort of flex its muscles a little bit to make its position well known. The greatest example of this policy comes in Panama. One of the effects of the Spanish-American War is that there had been a U.S. naval fleet that had been stationed in the Pacific that is recalled for fighting in the Caribbean when fighting breaks out between U.S. and Spain in 1898. And it takes them so long to get around the tip of South America and get up to the Caribbean that the war is actually over by the time they get to South America. And so that reiterates among Navy types in the U.S., and Roosevelt is very much a Navy type, the need for a trans-Isthmian canal across Central America, either across Nicaragua or Panama. Panama at this point is part of Colombia. The leader of Colombia, who's technically the vice president, it's a kind of oddly structured government at the time, senses that he kind of has Roosevelt over a barrel. Roosevelt comes to him, he says, look, we want to lease a piece of land across the Panamanian Isthmus. The Colombian leadership says, fine, but we're going to want a lot of money annually for this lease. Roosevelt doesn't want to pay it. Colombia kind of keeps upping the price. And instead, Roosevelt and the U.S. sponsor a revolution in Panama. And the newly created government, the first thing that it does is to lease a 10-mile wide zone across the middle of the country to the United States for the construction of a Panama Canal, which is then built between 1903 and 1914. The photograph on the left is a photo of the building of the canal, and a photograph on the right is the photo of among the very first ships that make it through the canal. This is it's a very laborious process to complete. This is a classic example of imperialism, right? So the United States is a stronger country than Colombia. Roosevelt wants a canal, and basically, uses American diplomatic and military might to get it. And Roosevelt describes his policy, perhaps apocryphally, but it's a good description, is that the way to handle events in when dealing with weaker countries is to speak softly, but to carry a big stick. And so here he is with this big stick, and the idea is that he's going to sort of hammer. This is to a certain extent of misapprehension in Roosevelt. I mean, the Colombia-Panama thing is clearly an example of outright imperialism. Roosevelt does a similar approach in the Dominican Republic, where in 1905, he basically takes over, or the U.S. basically takes over Dominican finances. The Dominican Republic had become heavily in debt to several European countries. They're in danger of defaulting on the debt. Roosevelt is worried that if they default on the debt, that maybe the Germans or the French or the British, to whom the Dominicans owed money, might send a military force to encourage collection. He wants to avoid European military intervention in the region. So he authorizes an arrangement where the U.S. takes over Dominican finances, basically repays the debt, and gives the Dominican Republic government the rest. The U.S. is essentially going to run the Dominican Republic until 1924. That too, it's a sort of standard imperialism approach. But Roosevelt often is interested in projecting U.S. power diplomatically or culturally. There's a gap between rhetoric and reality to a certain extent with Roosevelt. Even so, he carries the big stick, but he actually doesn't use a kind of outright imperialism all that much. He is, however, interested in projecting U.S. diplomatic power. Remember the last step, and I talked about the Russo-Japanese War. It's Roosevelt who mediates the end of that war in a conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And in 1905, he sort of reasserts himself again. This is our friend Wilhelm II for the previous snippet, the head of Germany. Wilhelm, among other things, decides that he wants Germany to have he calls it its place in the sun. He wants colonies. The problem is, by this point, most of Africa and Asia had already been scooped up by the other European powers. Remember, Bismarck, who had basically run German affairs from 1871 to 1890, had eschewed the idea of acquiring colonies. And so the Germans hadn't been active. In 1905, there's some political instability in Morocco, which is nominally an independent country, but really was under the control of the French. Wilhelm sends a German naval vessel to patrol the shores of Morocco. He sends a note to the Moroccan leader that Germany would be willing to assist them militarily if they want to get rid of French influence. There is a war scare that results from this. And the end result is a diplomatic conference called the Algeciras Conference. And traditionally, since the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the United States' approach to any political, international, diplomatic controversies in Europe had been, Europe is not our concern. The Europeans can do whatever they want. We're not going to diplomatically engage with this thing. Roosevelt, by contrast, is invited to send a delegation. This is the American delegation to Algeciras, and does do so. And the U.S. doesn't play a major role in the conference. Basically, what the conference does is to establish French control over Morocco, and to give Germany, as a kind of consolation prize, a new colony on the west coast of Africa called Cameroon. Now an independent country between Nigeria and Congo. But the fact that the U.S. is participating is another sign under Roosevelt of a more active role. That said, there are limits to Roosevelt's desire to project, which I think is an important way of understanding his presidency. There's a second major diplomatic confrontation during the Roosevelt presidency, and it comes with regard to this province of the Ottoman Empire, Bosnia-Herzegovina. This is an entity that we will be coming back to several times over the course. It's kind of a tinderbox of Europe. So it's part of the Ottoman Empire, but it is the fringe of the Ottoman Empire that borders Austria-Hungary. In the 1870s, these portions of the empire, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, become independent. Bosnia is isolated from the Ottomans, and Austria assumes a protectorate over Bosnia. So there's a recognition that the Ottoman Empire nominally still controls Bosnia, but Austria is kind of running things. And the Ottoman Empire is so weak, and they don't really have any military or political connection to Bosnia anymore. They kind of have to go along with this. In 1908, the Austrian government decides they're worried about increased nationalism from Serbia. There's a new government taking over Serbia. Austria decides it wants to expand its strategic presence in the Balkans, and it formally annexes Bosnia. And the result's the Congress, which is held in Berlin to try to resolve these tensions in the Balkans. And the Germans invite Roosevelt to attend the conference, but here Roosevelt declines. And Roosevelt's argument is, look, Morocco was important to us because we see the United States sees itself as an Atlantic power, and Morocco, is borders the Atlantic Ocean. But the Balkans are beyond U.S. strategic concerns. So the point here is that Roosevelt is expanding the United States, but only expanding it so far. And you can kind of see it from this chart as well. So this is foreign policy spending during the Roosevelt presidency. Yes, it's true that military spending increases during Roosevelt's 8 years in office, but not by a tremendous amount. It's not like there's a huge arms expansion under Roosevelt. And diplomatic, foreign aid, anything like that remains very, very small. So the core story to me, anyway, of the Roosevelt presidency is a greater presence, the acquisition of the Panama Canal, a willingness to engage sometimes with European matters, but also a sense that the U.S.'s prime strategic interests remain confined to the Caribbean, to Central America, to the Western Hemisphere, maybe more generally, but much less so to East Asia or Europe. So that's it for our second snippet.